Of course, in Sandton, following on then from the G20 with the UN Secretary-General, it was, of course, a little bit earlier, and now he will be received by International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola. Lamola's meeting with the UN leader provides an opportunity then to continue discussions on the priorities for the G20 presidency, the Sustainable Development Goals, plus on the other side, you have climate change promises which are still at play. Newzroom Afrika's Ziyanda Ngcobo is at the DIRCO headquarters and joins us live. The expectation here, Ziyanda, is certainly around those conversations that I've made note of, but really to receive and really to kick off the G20 in earnest.
Absolutely, and it's a big year for the Global South Arabile since South Africa is now the third Global South country to assume the G20 presidency after India in 2023 and Brazil in 2024. And of course, after that, it's going to be a while until a Global South country takes over the presidency of G20, which of course, as you know, accounts for 75% of international trade and 85% of the world's population. And so these are big numbers, and the level of negotiation and the support that you need from an international institution such as the United Nations is going to be critical. For one, António Guterres is very passionate about climate change. He always attends, the climate change conference, of course, as the UN Secretary-General. But last year in Dubai, COP28 making a lot of big financial commitments, and there is a sense that financing for issues such as climate change and other developmental projects are now being sidelined because of the wars taking place across the globe, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East for one, and yet Africa actually accounts for 70% of the conflict across the world. And so this is also something that was reflected then by DIRCO spokesperson Crispin Perry, actually making a very serious statement to say it's actually much easier to fund war than it is to finance developments. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We know that the geopolitical space currently is highly divided, with many conflicts taking place on the African continent alone. We have very big conflicts in the eastern DRC. In Sudan, we are seeing the highest humanitarian crisis we've ever seen. This is even accounted for by the Red Cross International. So all of these issues need to gain some level of primacy, the primacy of international law, but also the effectiveness of the UN as a multilateral institution is something that South Africa will have the opportunity to engage with the UN Secretary-General through our minister and later on with the president as well.
So those are very critical conversations, and of course the African continent feeling neglected, and really even at many other conferences across the world there's a sense that the agenda of the continent has been neglected, and this is something that the president has emphasized. Surely he will also say the same thing to Guterres when President Cyril Ramaphosa meets with him after this gathering with Ronald Lamola. In fact, I'm going to step out of shot now because it's understood that Guterres is now in the vicinity. He has left that G20 Sherpa meeting. It was the first one for the G20 Sherpas and the Deputy Reserve Bank governors. This is the first of a series of meetings, just over 130 meetings that are due to take place over the next 12 months. And of course, South Africa really going to be in the spotlight when it comes to, various issues. South Africa has been calling for the restructuring of the UN Security Council to have a permanent seat for the African continent, which is currently not in place. Agenda 2063, which is being spearheaded by the African Union, is also another issue that the president is due to put on the table. And so as you can see, those officials standing by to receive Guterres, he'll make his way through those doors and be welcomed by our very own International Relations Minister, Ronald Lamola. You would have heard from Crispin Perry earlier also talking about, the issue of just financing in general for developing nations. It's a critical issue because of just how much, the African continent contributes. The issues of beneficiation always come up, and there you can see our very own Ronald Lamola walking across there, António Guterres now walking through the OR Tambo building here in Tshwane, due to be received then, and a quick tete-a-tete between the two is set to take place. And of course, Guterres, once he leaves here, he'll be meeting with the president, who, as you'd know, was also in Mpumalanga today unveiling bridges. And he's probably on his way back. That gathering, a meeting, will be taking place at Mahlamba Ndlovu, where the president will also have a moment with the UN chief. Another key thing to be remembering as you see Guterres is that he is very critical in being able to spearhead important issues. In fact, tomorrow he'll be going to Lesotho for that country's bicentennial celebrations. He'll also be visiting then the Katsa Dam, which is very critical for the Lesotho Highlands water projects. It's also critical for us even as South Africa, and it's been adversely affected by climate change. It's a landlocked country. There's António Guterres saying good afternoon to us all. Let's listen in. All right, UN Chief António Guterres being welcomed by our very own Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola. They're expected to be behind closed doors for a couple of minutes, and thereafter he will make his way to meet with our President Cyril Ramaphosa, and we'll be moving now, as we move shots, to get a photo opportunity, of course, between the two as we move through the headquarters of DIRCO to get some of those visuals for you. So just bear with us, Arabile, as we move along with the series of events. And we're also expecting some remarks to be made then by both Guterres and the International Relations Minister.
All right, colleagues, thank you very much. Let's start moving. Thank you.
All right, as you can hear, Arabile, Crispin Perry rallying the troops. We only had a few minutes just to get those visuals between the two leaders. But as I was saying, a packed diary for António Guterres, as you've already reflected. He will be heading to Lesotho as a part of the Southern Africa trip that he's undertaking. And so he'll be meeting with the king there, King Letsie III, as well as the Prime Minister of Lesotho. Lots to talk about there. And as I've mentioned, climate change is something very close to the heart of António Guterres. And there's lots to talk about in terms of the SADC region. We have a conflict right next door in Mozambique. It's affected our border post here in Lebombo. These are all issues that have to be on the table, especially because of the underspending when it comes to development and financial development on the African continent.
Yeah, Ziyanda, I don't know if I could just get into one question as well, then, as we wrap this up as well. Just really a little bit earlier, we saw the Director General for the Department of International Relations, that's Ziyanda, actually speak a lot about whether the mandate of the G20 is actually beneficial to South Africa, to the global South at all in any way. And as you said, even having a permanent seat and whether that would be helpful. Is that the anticipation that this conversation would bring up, and that over the next 12 years, that at the very least, there'd be a lot more said in and around that?
I mean, I suspect part of the reason why Ziyanda would say that is because after South Africa's G20 presidency, it's going to be a while before a global South country assumes that position. Now, the United States is expected to assume the G20 presidency in 2026, and we already know the kind of language that has been touted by President Donald Trump around, imposing tariffs, 100% tariffs on BRICS member states. And in fact, Guterres was here Accra last year for our very own BRICS summit. So I suspect that Ziyanda would be mentioning that because of the fact that this is probably one of the few moments in the next 10 to 12 years where the Global South and South Africa's agenda and the continent's agenda can be firmly placed, high up there on the agenda of not only the UN Security Council, but also, all the security architecture across the world. There's lots of talk about how much funding has gone towards the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and yet in Sudan, that war has been waging for decades now, and not much is being spoken about. So these are some of the issues when we talk about placing the African agenda at the top of the priority list. This is what we're talking about. Why is it that we have 70% of the world's conflicts coming from Africa, and yet there's not much that's being spoken about in terms of trying to end those conflicts and trying to finance development of these nations? When you talk climate change, there's lots of talk about, the African continent really needing the financing to get that infrastructure going, to be able to have those early detection systems, for an example. All of this needs money that South Africa and the continent are going to want to have the G20 direct towards them in the next 12 months.
Ziyanda, thank you so much for that impressive work as well by yourself, as well as the camera operator there, Ngcobo as well, to really bring us those live visuals as it was happening as well. So thank you so much for that. Then, of course, we'll be continuing to follow the G20 presidency then that South Africa is holding, not just for today, of course, as António Guterres meets the President Cyril Ramaphosa a little bit later on, but certainly as well throughout 2025, as South Africa officially assumes that presidency.